Everybody. My name is Vasile Ciorici and I'm coming from the University of Coimbra, but I am originally from Moldova. I want to say thank you for the opportunity to participate at this conference via YouTube and present this paperwork that I'm going to present to the first Congress International do Direito, Governança e Inovação. I hope my Spanish was alright. Well, what I'm going to talk about is the Russia and its connection with the far-right parties of Europe and the challenge of these connections to human rights and liberal order principles. Well, today it's well known that Russia and many far-right parties in Europe are contesting the liberal order. And their alternative to this order, we could say, author says that is illiberalism. What is illiberalism? Illiberalism represents a threat to liberal democracy and human rights because in illiberalism, the democratic government, so-called democratic government, they hold free election, but they don't honor the rule of law and the rights of their citizens. So in our paperwork, which I wrote for discipline I did at the master degree here and call it Roots to Democracy, I puzzled around the question how a challenge to liberal democracy order in general from Russia and other far-right parties in Europe in general is a challenge to human rights in particular too. This is because democracy and human rights belong firmly together, and that democracy is a system of government which is most likely to defend human rights. Therefore, an attack on democracy is an attack on human rights because they guarantee each other. I start with my research with Russia's challenge to liberal democracy is a challenge to human rights. So we know that Russia, since the Cold War, had this common goal being a democratic and non-democratic country. And Russia in recent years has taken, authors say, an Eurasian identity that opposes the European Union in terms of values and human rights as well. It adopted nationalist policies to protect itself from Western pressures of democratizations and pressures to protect human rights. So to do that, Russia didn't abandon completely democracy. It used elections to legitimize its power, especially these false-faced institutions that exist in Russia. They used elections to legitimize the lack of power rotation in Russia, which is called by authors as electoral authoritarianism. What this means that you have elections, you have period elections, but you don't have a rotation of power. The power doesn't change, it all stays the same. This kind of form of authoritarianism had to find its own ideology. So in recent years, to explain or to position itself at home and abroad, Russia adopted Putin state civilization. It's a type of ideology that positions Russia as a global defender of conservative, so-called conservative values. This is called new form of confrontation. This new form of confrontation that we can see today from Russia and from far-right parties switched from the old Cold War East-West vertical conflict to horizontal, where we have conservative and traditionalists against liberal, multicultural and transnational assentments with their tolerant human rights principles. In Russia, they call it control democracy, that the author call it, because you have a simulation of liberal democracy and human rights, freedoms and protections. This form of government existing in Russia is described by authors like Zakaria as the gravest danger that illiberal democracy can pose, not just to own people that is restricting their rights, but in general it will discredit liberal democracy itself, forming a shadow on democratic governance, undermine the credibility of this form of government as the one that protects human rights. So we see that Russia gives us the example in its challenge to human rights and its challenge to the liberal values, shows that the elections is not enough to get to a liberal democratic governance. There are other elements, other pillars to get to a democratic government that would protect human rights. One of them is civil society. Well, why? I argue that an active civil society is expected through the mobilization of its members to counterbalance and the anti-liberal inclination of a democratic elected majority. In the Western doctrine, the civil society is seen as the last source of individual rights and liberties, which have to be protected against the incursion of the state. It must be self-governant, without any control from outside forces, including the state as well, while participating in it should be mainly voluntarily. This essential pillar, I argue, is the troubling factor that Kremlin sees as a threat to its power. So, because it failed to provide these rights and liberties, as well as welfare and social justice, the Russian citizens. So Kremlin started to limit the public sphere by creating state-sponsored organization, called it Nashi in Russian, which means ours, and imposed control of non-governmental organizations, NGOs in Russia, especially the one that received funding from outside. Kremlin sees liberal democracy ideology as nothing more than something an ideological idea promoted by the West that in fact doesn't want to defend human rights principles but defends realistic and strategic interests, so to guarantee that no other regional blocs arise to challenge and compete with the American global structure, which they see today international system as an American global structure through protected using human rights. So the principle of pluralism and tolerance that exists today in the EU, and which are important part of human rights principle, and later made possible new ideologies in families such as same-sex union, single-parent families, are being judged by Kremlin as something immoral and shameful that is corrupting the youth. And Russia, in this way, has passed anti-gay propaganda laws and to promote the traditional Russian Orthodox Church's values over the values of the West. Why is that? This was its counterweight, its alternative to European open society, to European principle of tolerance and multicultural. This is and here Russia created a bridge, an ideological bridge that connected with the far-right parties, because far-right parties in Europe have a similar view over what values should we defend and how an international society should be today. The far-right party Front National that everybody knows in France, which is the biggest in Europe, and its leader Marine Le Pen admires Kremlin policy as they wait on the idea of eternal Russia that has conservative values and morals, and which, according to Le Pen, almost are disappearing in France and in Europe. And therefore, Moscow receives admiration and support from European far-right parties and movements. And in return, Kremlin provides them with political and even financial support that are helping them, in fact, to get real political power. Why is it so important to talk about far-right parties? Because by the term of far-right, we mean to describe a wide range of right-wing nationalists and populist parties, and that have ultra-right conservative ideology and are well known for their opposite to immigration and are radical nationalists. Although we can differentiate the far-right party from fascism, there are many elements present and in the far-right party ideologies, many fascist elements. Accordingly, these political parties, which are driven by anti-elitism and economic protectionism, usually are we can characterize them as xenophobic, and which promote an aggressive nationalism. Many of them, including Front National, are associated with Islamophobia, with radical nationalism, and even racism. They call it the new racism. Their challenge to the liberal open society consists in them seeing ethnic differences as something basic, undisputable, and hypothetical destructive part of political life. Their voters define themselves as nationalists and consider the immigration and the freedom of movement that other individuals have outside their country as a threat to their own country. We saw that in recent national and EU elections proved that many far-right parties are still getting more and more many votes and real political power. Their relationship with Russia are seen as by specialists in the area like Laurel as some tactical alliances against the EU and its liberal principles. So you have EU institutions, you have EU values that are both threatened by Russia and far-right parties. The Russian connection with far-right parties of Europe serve as new beginning for the new shared practice and expectations. So there are expectations that a society should be less democratic like in Russia, less freedoms, and more illiberal, more anti-human rights. And these practices are changing the structure of liberal order, which with its thick norms of human rights. So why did we arrive at this conclusion? Well, according to English school, that states and other international actors are disposed rather than forced to act on the basis of existing practice and to justify their actions according to the shared values, norms, and rules. Well, if we today have the practice, values, and norms of protecting human rights, of having freedoms, of having tolerance, then this new practice through far-right parties supported by Russia give rise to new illiberal practice, anti-human rights. Why is this good for Russian far-right parties? Because this would legitimize both the parties, the extreme parties, and Russia's illiberal attitudes and their actions against human rights in international order. So Russia's policies to support these parties are the instruments that Kremlin fights the liberal order and human rights, attacking from inside its system of values, shared rules, norms, and even standards of morality. So we could say that today, with far-right parties like Front National that got almost 35%, and then the last presidential vote we have Jobbik in Hungary, where we have Freedom Party in Austria. This illiberal practice and expectation inside the liberal world jeopardizes the future of not just the world, but as well as the EU bloc, which is the biggest defender of human rights. These parties, they challenge almost every value and principle and specified in Article 2 of EU Treaty, questioning, putting a big question on whether the European Union is founded on respect for human dignity, or freedom, or democracy, or equality, or considering their anti-immigrant rhetoric. Could we say today that the EU countries are based in respect for human rights, including the rights of person belonging to minorities? So basically that's the time. I would talk about this more. If you have any questions, you can always reach me through email or my telephone number, which you can find later in the on the website of the Congress. And thank you very much. It was a pleasure.